Now, the charity, which runs the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, has had a tenfold increase in visits to its website in the past 2 weeks. Refuge said numbers have spiked again significantly since it started recording rises during lockdown. Yet, figures revealed to the BBC after a Freedom of Information request show that more UK police forces recorded a fall in calls about domestic violence at the start of the lockdown than recorded a rise. Why? Abby Newbury has this.
For some, lockdown has meant feeling trapped in an abusive situation at home.
It just got me down more and more. I thought, I can't go on like this.
This is one woman's experience, recreated and voiced by actors to protect her identity.
He got more and more aggressive, saying he'd like me to go now. He got a stick, and he came back with it, and he stood there with the stick in his hand, and he said, I want you out now or I'm going to hurt you, and you know I can kill you, waving this stick at me. And he really, really did frighten me.
This woman has now escaped her situation, but that's not the case for many. The BBC asked all 45 of the UK's police forces how many domestic abuse calls they'd had. 41 responded. More than half had fewer calls at the start of lockdown than at the same time last year. But that's not the case for Refuge, a domestic abuse charity that's seen 66% more calls and almost 1,000% increase to its website in lockdown, as Director of Communications Lisa King explains.
Refuge is concerned to see such demand on its services, and what we really want all women to know is that they are not alone, that domestic abuse is a crime, and that Refuge is here to support them every hour of every day. It shows that domestic abuse is perhaps a bigger issue than we had even anticipated in this country.
But why is there not a similar recorded increase in police calls?
There needs to be an understanding of what domestic abuse is.
Claire Walker is a domestic abuse consultant, and she thinks more training is needed to spot the signs.
100% of victims will experience coercive control. Not so much what he does, it's about what he disables her from being able to do. Their systems, their policy and practices needs to change. I am tired of police officers not understanding what coercive control is.
The country's leading domestic abuse police officer, Louisa Rolfe, says that all frontline officers across the UK receive training to spot the signs of coercive or controlling behaviour. She adds that they're working with domestic abuse charities to understand the nature of their demand.
Let's talk then to Natasha Saunders. She was verbally, physically and psychologically abused by her ex-partner. In 2018, he was found guilty of 3 counts of rape and 1 count of sexual assault and sentenced to 12 years and then 3 years on licence. She has waived her right to anonymity to talk to you today. And obviously the nature of our conversation means you may not want young children to be around while we're discussing this. Also with us, Claire Walker, who you saw in that film. Thank you both very much for talking to us. Can I start with you, Natasha? Can you help our audience understand what it might feel to be living at home during lockdown with a violent partner?
I think, I lived sort of 8 years in lockdown, and when I first heard about the lockdown situation, my immediate thought was there are going to be so many people that are, in close confines with people that wish them harm, whether it's psychological, physical, there's no escaping it. And it's quite easy to say, well, why don't you just leave? But it really isn't. As was said in the piece you just played, it's about disabling that behaviour, and they disable the feeling that you have any strength or access to any services that may make you leave. And just for women, they're living in hell right now.
I'm struck by the fact that you said you lived in lockdown effectively for 8 years.
Yeah.
Can I ask what that meant to you for your daily life?
I wasn't allowed out unless my perpetrator was with me. I could do the school run and things, but I would be quizzed on who I spoke to. I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody when I was with him. I couldn't make eye contact. If I made eye contact with a man who had held a door open for us in the shop, if I made eye contact, I would be called names. I'd be verbally insulted with the most disgusting words that you can think of. You know, you know, he raped me. He went to prison for the rape. We all have this sort of idea of rape as this Jack the Ripper type figure who hides down an alleyway. For me, my rapist sat across the breakfast table from me every morning and said, well, what have you got a face on today for? You know, why have you got an attitude? And that's what normalises that behaviour. I think a lot of people don't understand that when you live through it, especially for years, you get to a point where it seems normal.
The first part of what you described is what we now know as coercive control. Affecting who your friends are, saying that you can't look at certain people or in a certain way or dress a certain way. That's what is coercive control. And that was brought into law in this country in 2015. Yeah. Do you think enough police forces still recognise what it is?
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, I left in early 2015, and unfortunately I experienced an awful lot of failings is a strong word, but I was let down quite a few times by the coercive control that my ex-husband was perpetrating after I left. He was getting in contact with friends and family. He was emailing people who worked with me. He was, you know, there was a very big sort of spectrum of as soon as he knew I was doing anything, he would go on the attack. And although he was on bail for no direct or indirect contact, say for a solicitor, you know, every time I sort of went to a police officer and said, look, he's contacted my mum, he's contacted one of my best friends, he's contacted, I'd just ignore him. And it's not really acceptable. That they need to sort of understand the mental pressure it puts you under, knowing that that control is still there.
Natasha, I'll come back to you in a moment. I'm just going to bring in Claire Walker, who is an expert in domestic abuse. I want to ask you about these figures from Refuge, Claire. Over the past 3 consecutive weeks, they've had a 66% increase in calls to their helpline. In the past 2 weeks, a 957% increase in web traffic. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, firstly, I would say what those figures are telling us is that domestic abuse is the constant pandemic that is around us inside of COVID and outside of it as well. But I think when it comes to reaching out and identifying that I am a victim, you know, like was just being explained, it's a difficult position to be in to say, okay, I think I'm a victim. The intensification of abuse experienced during lockdown means that people will start reaching out. There's less services and opportunities for them to be able to reach any other services or to reach people and communicate with people. Being in lockdown, if they're furloughed or they're working from home, they've got no sanctuary to escape from him and his toxicity that's there all of the time. So it doesn't surprise me that there is increase. I think this is representing the reality that we know is there all of the time. And it is much easier for me to pick up the phone and ask for some support and intervention for me as a victim, for an agency to help me with what I'm dealing with. To pick up the phone and call the police is asking the police to intervene with my perpetrator. And that might feel like a little bit too risky. Because the police, in normal times, they do fail victims. We know that. We know that from the amount of murders that happen on an annual basis.
Yeah, they don't always fail victims. We should say that. I mean, the police have made absolutely unbelievable strides and progress over the years in terms of helping those who are experiencing domestic abuse, and that includes men as well as women. I want to ask you then, this disparity between, for example, the figures that Refuge have put out today, this big rise, compared to the fact that most UK police forces, according to these FOI requests from the BBC, have seen a drop in calls about domestic violence. Is that, do you think, Claire, because it's too scary to ring 999, actually, if your perpetrator's about, or is it that police are not recognising that the call they are receiving from an individual is a domestic abuse call, or both?
I think it's both. I think it's both, and we see that all the time. And yes, I would acknowledge the police are trying, but in conversations I have had, it is already being identified where the flaws are, where the gaps are in terms of a police intervention and a victim's lived experience. So if a victim rings up the police to say, you know, is criticising what I'm wearing, is criticising dinner, he raped me last night, you know, like we were just hearing then it isn't necessarily that the police are going to log that as domestic abuse. I see too many logs.
Well, what else would it be logged on, Claire? Logged as?
Well, I've seen logs where they're reporting that there's been name calling or there's been shouting and arguments. There are no arguments in domestic abuse. There is staged events that look like an argument but feel exceptionally different.
Okay, that's really interesting what you said about the way things are logged. What should examples that you've just given us like that be logged as?
Domestic abuse.
Right. Simple as that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
How would you describe, I mean, everybody watching can understand what sexual assault means, what rape means. How would you describe coercive control? Because that is still an area where people don't get it.
Yeah, well, it's the what I refer to as the carbon monoxide in an abusive relationship. Because, you know, if he's punching me in the face, I understand what that is. I might rationalise it differently, but I understand what that is. If he is doing the name calling and reducing my self-esteem, I don't understand what that is. I find it harder to identify, as does society on the whole. But there's nowhere to reinforce to me, oh, yeah, that's what it is. So coercive control is a context of a pattern of behaviours, and we need to start looking less at what it is that he is doing and trying to get some analysis on that, and looking more at what he is preventing her from doing, what's changing about her. You know, we were just hearing about needing to check in on the school run or check in when we're going to the shops and being available to our perpetrator all the time. But to society and to ourselves, to a degree, we know that we're just functioning normally. We're doing the school run, we're going to work, etc.
Natasha, you contacted the domestic abuse helpline, I understand, when you were going through the violence you were experiencing.
Yeah.
Was it a big step to do that or not?
It was immense. It's, as Claire's just so rightly said, it's very difficult to address coercive control. Even rape, you know, I was at the point of, if I was a better wife, maybe if I wanted to sleep with him multiple times a day, maybe if I did hoover the house 5 times a day like he wanted me to, maybe he would be happy, maybe it's a fault with me. And so for me to get to the point, I mean, I originally knew I needed to leave back when I was about 8 weeks pregnant with my daughter, who's now 11. And it took me almost 6 years past that point to actually walk out the door and never return. And that was thanks to Refuge's helpline. You know, it's hard to identify yourself as a victim. It's even harder to admit you're a victim, you know, to go to somebody, you know, and I didn't know what to expect when I phoned the helpline. And as Claire said, phoning the police is that intervention that feels like it might just be one little bit further than you know, you're hoping to step. And, you know, you've got that element of not knowing. And I sort of phoned, and the lady at the end of the phone validated me. She said, what you're experiencing is illegal. It's not fair. It's not right. You know, you are right in your concerns that he's controlling you and that he's psychologically abusing you. You know, the coercive control is there. And she said, you know, these are the things you can do about it. She didn't say, okay, you have to leave. And yeah, it was a very, you know, sort of profound moment for me. It saved my life, without a doubt.
Wow, when you say it like that, it really does strike home, doesn't it? I want to thank you both very much for coming on the programme today, talking to us on air this morning. You will have helped a number of people, no doubt. And we have some numbers to give out as well. Thank you, Claire. Natasha, thank you so much for being so open. Thank you. Just to let you know that the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, which is run by Refuge, is 0808 2000 247. Or you can go to their website if you can't pick up a phone, nationaldahelpline.org.uk. I always get messages from people who say that's not the number for Scotland, so I want to give you that because it is a different number. 0800 027 1234. 0800 027 1234. In the next hour.